Warm greetings to all of you joining us from across and beyond our greater South. And welcome once again to The Third Way, live with the SG. Our informal, more personal space to speak, reflect, and exchange, without intermediaries, without filters, about the challenges before us and the possibilities that lie within our reach in our collective endeavor to build a third way of development. From the Greater South, by the Greater South, for humanity. As always, I will begin by sharing a few reflections, and then, most importantly, I will open the floor to your questions and views, which you can send, I believe, through the comment section from whichever platform you are joining us, or on the WhatsApp number that should be appearing on the screen at the present moment. Today, I would like to continue from our last episode, even though it was 2 weeks ago, by sharing a few reflections from my recent publication, a letter from the Greater South, una carta meridional for those who prefer the original Spanish, which we have here as well. In particular, amidst what appears to be the dusk of the world order, inherited from the 1990s, a time of uncertainty and perils, but also of extraordinary possibility, I would like to talk about what I have called in the letter the political bankruptcy of the dichotomies. For if we are to ensure that the current unmaking of the status quo does not merely lead to the deconstruction of what we know, only to be replaced with greater violence, further inequality, exacerbated injustice, if we are to embrace an optimism of will, coming together to ensure that a moribund order that is collapsing under its own weight with little need for an external push is to be replaced by a better, more equitable, sustainable and prosperous future for all, in the South and in the North alike, then we must also equip ourselves with the pessimism of intelligence that will enable us to identify the challenges ahead, but not in order to resign ourselves to them, but to better overcome them. In short, we need the lucidity to see the dangers clearly, but have the courage to act in spite of them. And one of the greatest challenges of this global transition in this fertile yet fragile moment of history is that we continue to think with exhausted frameworks. Frameworks that no longer explain nor transform our world, yet still limit our capacity to think and act within it. And across our countries, the sense of political fatigue is palpable. We can see it in speeches that no longer inspire, in actions that have become the repetition of empty routines, in slogans that used to rally and today are hardly even capable of becoming a viral hashtag. In short, the South, as a political body, in the noblest possible sense of the term, appears to wander aimlessly, dragging behind it legacies that it seems unable to rejuvenate, energies that it can no longer summon. The panorama of the existing political currents, still locked in dualisms of the 20th century, is one of terminal weariness. And since these live streams are meant to be without filters, let us be frank. Both the left and the right, and the many tendencies born between them, have reached their limits. The left, which once upon a time was invigorated by the potency of a collective dream, now suffers from three disfiguring ills. First, it has surrendered to the frameworks imposed by the status quo, turned away from the horizon that once guided it, and abandoned the utopia that used to be able to convene our peoples to march. Governance, for it, has often come to mean efficiently managing the little that is immediately possible, and long-term visions have been relegated to a tomorrow that never arrives. In starting to speak the language of the system that it had vowed to change, it has lost its own banners. And under the quiet tyranny of technocracy, where every aspiration, every vision, every dream is reduced to the cold, incomplete letter of a piece of legislation, change is inevitably disregarded. Because on that terrain, the status quo always wins. Second, wherever it did govern, the left did achieve undeniable gains in social justice, but it failed to nurture, in parallel, the collective consciousness that could sustain them. And without politicization, there can be beneficiaries, yes, of course, but never true citizens. It lost the opportunity of fostering an engaged, critical citizenry, capable of defending hard-won social gains, whilst, at the same time, demanding what is still lacking. And third, the left forgot the art of strategy. Just as it was eager to battle powerful structures and interests, it forgot the art of strategy. Of course, there is some understandable, even if highly narcissistic, gratification in immediately declaring every plan, as if exaggerated transparency was a political virtue. But that only opens the door to effective sabotage. On the other hand, absolute secrecy does not protect a project. It only deprives it of the collective support that it needs to thrive. And between this exaggerated transparency that exposes every plan to sabotage and this excessive secrecy that isolates every effort, transformative action remains paralyzed. Now, I say this of the left, but I assure you that the right, it appears to me, does not fare any better. First, in adopting the neoliberal creed without reserve, it was infected by the virus of complacency. The laissez-faire doctrine may perhaps suit, and even then it's highly debatable, but it may perhaps suit advanced economies. But in societies that are still striving for authentic development, it is nothing more than an administration of scarcity. That is, to reduce governance to the management of limited, basic public services presupposes the prior existence of developed, productive forces, which, in most of our countries, simply do not yet exist. Second, with its obsession with macroeconomic indicators, the right has forgotten the concrete realities of our popular microeconomies. Globalization, with all its touted benefits, has also swept away the livelihoods of farmers, artisans, and local shopkeepers, whose misery is hidden behind impressive GDP growth and forecasts. Balance and Excel sheets simply do not know the face of human despair. And third, seduced by the individualistic myths spun by tech billionaires, the right has ignored the structural barriers of its own contexts. It has forgotten that without infrastructure, without their own capital, without access to markets of scale, the young Southern entrepreneur is doomed from the outset either to stagnate as a startup or to emigrate in order to succeed. And as our larger companies have too often settled into the role of importers and intermediaries as well-behaved electrons that always follow the path of least resistance, we often remain today exporters of raw materials rather than creators of real value. But the exhaustion does not stop with left and right. Our social progressives, although yes, they are full of good intentions, seem incapable of prioritizing their struggles according to the concrete realities of the South. For instance, to combat, and rightly so, a patriarchy that has marginalized women, they offer inclusive language to those who are hungry. Instead of addressing their tangible needs and building a broad, popular movement to address the intersection of many forms of injustice, of gender, of ethnicity, of class. And therefore, let us be clear, posturing is not politicization, and moral self-righteousness is not social change. And yet, on the other hand, our conservatives seem to have no other horizon than that of opposition. Resistance to anything that is new has become their only program. They defend meritocracy in societies where opportunity was never equal, and glorify a past that never existed. But in that process, one neither resolves the problem of unemployment nor mends our broken social contracts. This does not build nations. It only nourishes resentment. And resentment does not feed, it does not organize, and it certainly does not emancipate. Then, of course, we have the globalists, who, in their identical posts on LinkedIn, speak the language of global statistics, but have forgotten the grammar of popular reality. They justify their blindness as analysis and scorn popular discontent. Instead of promoting, as they ought, local circular economies, decentralization and investment policies in rural areas, and addressing the subsidiarity of many of our countries in the global economy, they publish technocratic, self-indulgent op-eds in paywalled papers that most of our peoples won't read, in order to explain to those same people, again with data in hand, that they are misunderstanding their own precariousness, misinterpreting their own lived realities, and even, sometimes, that they are wrong to feel what they feel. And finally, we have the isolationists, who seem incapable of seeing how chimeric the idea of total self-sufficiency truly is. Although yes, they are right to reject dependency, they fall into the illusion of autarky instead of proposing a transformative project that combines strategic independence and synergetic interdependence. They forget that sovereignty without bridges is not independence, but solitude. And so, here we are now, at a critical point where the dualist frameworks that have governed the last 3 decades are clearly exhausted. What our times demand, therefore, are new, constructive paradigms rooted in our collective and respective lived experiences that address the real insidious division of our era, the division that separates reform from transformation. That is, what separates cosmetic, contained change that never addresses root causes from the endeavors that fundamentally alter dynamics and uproot the very basis of injustice. But, of course, as always, there is a but. The problem of transformation is how demanding it is. Whilst reform seduces us by offering a short sprint, a quick run, transformation requires us to be farmers that continue to sow, even if they may never themselves taste the fruit of the future. In sum, and this perhaps summarizes the OSC, long-term impact always struggles to compete with short-term outputs. And this is why we can no longer afford to treat our peoples as mere beneficiaries, but we must allow them to be true to their own nature, that of being protagonists of their own destiny, equal farmers who are entirely aware and content in the collective duty, historic duty, of sowing now, even if it is future generations that will benefit from the harvest. Our cause, then, cannot be limited to the co-administration of its results. It must also be co-created in its process. And here, what we are proposing is not a lukewarm merger of the doctrines of the left and of the right, nor an equidistant midpoint between extremes, which only leads, in fact, to impotent centrism. Our times, our peoples, the entirety of the weight of history demand an entirely new horizon. And hence, our affirmation that it is imperative for us, collectively, to build from the greater self a third way of development, rising from the lived realities of our peoples, conjugating the rural and the urban, the traditional and the modern, the endogenous and the borrowed, and supported by a new kind, an authentic kind of multilateralism. One of equality amongst parties, equity in relations, and horizontal solidarity instead of vertical charity. And in our next episode, I will share some thoughts in light of the countless ideological, cultural, and contextual differences across our countries on possible manners of undertaking this colossal construction, without negating our immeasurable diversity and respective sovereign prerogative, but by articulating and transcending them. Until then, and for now, because I know that we have Pearl, our dear Pearl, that does not want me to speak for too long, I open the floor to your questions and comments and continue this exchange until the next episode, where, aside from the critique, we will speak about what can be done. Thank you. So, of course, as a reminder to all of you You can drop your comments, questions, critiques, views in the comment sections of whichever platform you have chosen to join us, or indeed by WhatsApp. And therefore I see a question from Ephraim from Ethiopia that says, "Dear Excellency, I enjoy your talks. The OSCE goals and endeavors are simply magnificent, and I don't understand why everyone from the South is not lining up and giving it their all. I know the campaigns." This sounds familiar. I'm speaking to the team. It's from the last episode that I didn't answer. Are you sure? Okay. Well, are you certain? Okay. Well, you can answer. It's fine. They can hear your voice as well. They know that I have a team here, because I know that I haven't presented the team. I usually do it at the start, but the last time the team complained with fervor that I had spent too much time presenting them. So I gave them the favor this time around, not to present them. But I do it now, and they can pull my ears later. We have Jim here, Jim Ochiti, who is heading our PACE office. We have Al-Idrisi, Abdurrahim Al-Idrisi, as well from PACE. We have Fabian Flores, Betty Solomon, Pearl Umura, but you know all of those people. Today we have a privilege. Now, Pearl, yes, I affirm Pearl is here. But I am saying that today we have a privilege because the past few episodes I ended up presenting the same people again and again. So we have today as well Hidayat Chilkoparan, who is heading as principal coordinator our multilateral accreditation task force, which is a task force created earlier this year to enhance our cooperation with other multilateral organizations. And we have also the extraordinary Kulsi Lamko, who some of you who have been faithful followers of this platform must know. And you must know him, because he is, even though he has not been attending the past few episodes, the brain behind the live stream. I saw him, his eyes opened up wide. I know people will not like it, some of the team members, but let me digress. I am an Arab after all. I have recently adopted a cat called Harakat. For those who don't know what Harakat means, ask one of your Gulf and Arab friends. But Harakat gets sometimes very surprised and opens up her eyes very widely, which is basically what Kulsi just did when I said he was the brains. But credit must be given where credit is due. And that is that he conceived of these live streams, planned even their setup, and therefore he is back with us, and currently he heads as director of Office of Culture, Heritage and the Arts. So now that I have done the presentations against advice of counsel, I will now proceed to the questions from last week and this week that I missed, not last week, last episode, and the ones. I did answer this question about volunteers. So I see another question from James. How do you see the capacity of the Greater South to co-shape the emerging new international system, which is to be more equitable, fairer, and more just, and serve the entire humanity? What kind of strategies should it pursue to that end? And lastly, how can the OSCE be instrumental in these efforts? I thank warmly James for this question, which is very substantive. In fact, I think it was yesterday, was it Jim, that I had, or the day before yesterday, that we had an interview with Press TV, and they asked a similar question. And I think, let me break up your question and challenge some parts of it. I do not believe that currently what we are seeing is the emergence of a new international system. What we are seeing today is the unmaking of the international system that we inherited from the 1990s in many respects. But the construction has not yet started. We are at a crossroads as countries of the Greater South. The world may, the system may emerge more equitable, fairer, more sustainable, more prosperous for everyone. And I say for everyone because, as I was saying to Press TV, our endeavor is not against the North. We don't want to be the new North. We want to be equals. Now, either we achieve that better order, that better system, or indeed, we can go down the road of further violence, further rule of the strongest, further rule of the wealthiest, further inequality. And both of those are today paths that open up. We are in a period of, in fact, in my letter from the Greater South, this is in English, so it was translated. And the translation makes me very unhappy in terms of the title, because the subtitle in Spanish was Apuntes desde el claroscuro mundial. Now in English it was translated as Notes Amidst Global Disorder. But in Spanish what it actually says is notes, and I understand why it wasn't translated this way, because it's not a common word. But claroscuro basically means half light. This moment of shadow play, where it isn't night, it isn't day, it isn't darkness, it isn't light. And it's a direct reference. Of course, in English, the actual translation would be chiaroscuro, which is actually taken directly from Italian, but it usually refers to paintings. But it's a reference to Antonio Gramsci, who wrote this extraordinary sentence, which I think is very applicable today. And I will need you to unlock the computer. This extraordinary sentence. I was going to look, and I apologize in advance. James, that was the name. And a direct reference to Antonio Gramsci that mentioned, that the old world is dying and the new world is struggling to be born. And in this claroscuro, in this half light, in this half shadow play, the time is the time of the emergence of monsters. And I think that today we are in that point. And I do not think that the word monster is anywhere dramatic. We have seen what has happened for 2 years in Gaza. And we celebrate the fact that there is, no matter how tenuous it is, a cessation of the genocide temporarily. Even though reconstruction is not there yet. Even though the displaced will remain displaced for many years to come. And even though, until now, 58% of Gaza is occupied. But we are in this moment of half-play. And I think that our entire endeavor from the Greater South, James, is precisely to say that we have to come together to build a better future for ourselves, as well as prevent the emergence of monsters. Now, what this means concretely in terms of your question, because I have not forgotten. But remember that I am an Arab by nature, which is, as I have often said, the antithetical, I would even say the antidote, to Americans from a rhetorical sense. Whereas Americans like to go straight to the point, we the Arabs like to walk around, smell the flowers, look at the stars, sit down and lie down in the grass or in the sand, and for a moment even forget where we were going before eventually getting there. And therefore, I have not forgotten your questions, which is about co-shaping the international order. I just wanted to be clear. Today, there is no construction undergoing. And therefore, our role is not to choose whether to co-shape or not to co-shape the emerging international order. It is whether to remain passive, wait and see, be in the antechamber of decision-making, and allow the world to drift, or avail ourselves of this opportunity, in which the ties that have, the chains, in fact, that have tied up and constrained our greater south for so many decades are finally coming undone. Avail ourselves of this moment, which will not last forever, to build a new system. And build a new system, not necessarily, what is the expression I believe in for the British, or the Americans even, throwing the baby with the bathwater. Nobody's promoting this. There are certain parts of the system that must be kept. But availing ourselves of this opportunity. Now, to get to your question, what does this mean concretely? It means, on the one hand, recognizing that there is an imperative to transform our international organizations that we inherited from post-World War II. Here, I am saying a platitude, James. This has been said time and time again. At the most recent United Nations General Assembly, many leaders said that. But at the same time, we have to understand that precisely because it is an area of consensus amongst our countries that those organizations need to be reformed, we have to ask ourselves, why has it not happened? And it has not happened because we have, and I always believe this, the harshest criticism must be directed at oneself. And we have, as the Greater South, complacently adopted the role of lonely lovers lamenting the loss of the loved one. We are Majnoon, and the international system, or our aspiration of reform, is Leela, to make a reference to Arab poetry from the 7th century. I highly recommend it, from the Mu'allaqat. Of lonely lovers lamenting, being scorned, of victims that complain of injustice. That is, what we have spent our time doing is supplicating, begging sometimes, for the reform of the international financial architecture, going to those that currently dominate the system as it is. That is, they dominate it because the system is currently reflecting how the world was and not how it is. And yet, nothing happened. And that is because you cannot enter a negotiation with no leverage. If you enter a negotiation with no leverage and with the inability to walk away, it's not a negotiation. It's a very harsh beating. And therefore, what can we do about it? We have to continue asking for the reform, but we must also reinforce, number one, our regional integrations that ensure that we find basically strength in what has been the historic terrain of our defeats. finds strength in unity. But not a unity that imposes uniformity, but a unity that emerges from the encounter of our differences, recognizing that in each of our regions, our countries, our peoples share fundamental, inextricable interests that transcend political differences. So we must reinforce regional integrations, authentic regional integrations, not limited to conferences that happen every few years, but regional integration that ensures people-to-people exchanges, mobility, that ensures trade amongst our countries without having to go through intermediaries. Second, we must invest strategically in key areas of our economies that will allow us to supersede, to overcome the structural dependency that is inherent to their current models. As I've mentioned in the past, we need a bold plan, a third way of development, to invest in education, to invest in health, to invest in sustainable agriculture that is not directed towards exports, but is directed towards feeding our own people and reducing our imports, towards sustainable and renewable and clean energies that achieves as well energy, sustainability, and sovereignty for our peoples. We need to invest in the infrastructure that connects our continents and therefore opens up markets for our peoples. We must invest in high value-added industrialization to make sure that we do not remain net exporters of raw or intermediary materials, but are actually exporters of high value-added products. And how do we do that? And I am still on my second point. It is a three-point plan with many sub-points. Arab way. How do we do that? We need to create more financial institutions of our countries. Today, the OSCE, under OSCE General Assembly mandate, is working towards, in the near future, we hope, the operationalization of the Greater South Development Bank. And that is a crucial step, but it is not enough. We need other economic leverage points. This includes, as I've mentioned in this letter from the Greater South, creating OPECs of the Greater South in sectorial areas where we would organize our strengths. You have all heard me, probably for those of you who have been following us for some time, speak of coffee. I will not reiterate time and time again the story of coffee. I will only remind you of two facts. Coffee only grows in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Of the top 10 coffee exporters in the world, 4 out of the 10 are from a region that does not have a single coffee tree. France, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany. We export coffee, that is coffee producing countries, on average at less than $3 the bag, which is, mind you, the fair trade price. Whereas they export, on average, at $40 the bag, because they export Nescafe, they export Nespresso, they export capsules, instant coffee, processed coffee, coffee with value addition. We export green beans. And go to any of our countries from the south that does not produce coffee but has a neighbor that produces coffee, and I assure you, go to a hotel and what they will be serving you in the hotel room will not be the coffee from the neighbor, it will be coffee coming from Switzerland, which will be Nescafe. Now, why create an OPEC of coffee? Not to monopolize. Nobody says that the Swiss should no longer produce Nescafe. They should, they can continue to do so. But we must create this OPEC of coffee, first, to stabilize prices in a market that has high volatility. 2, to redirect a percentage, not the entirety, of our green bean production towards high value addition in our countries. that is, redirecting a certain percentage that would be agreed amongst all countries, like in OPEC with regards to oil, so no countries at a disadvantage, a certain percentage towards coffee roasting and processing facilities, towards the capsule factories of our countries. And third, and this is not the least important, I know it might sound romantic, but it is not the least important, on the contrary, because it is the essence of everything that we do, which is bring back dignity to those at the base of production that have been for too long disregarded and exploited. Who could look at the coffee farmer that receives crumbs for their coffee that they cultivated, when multinational companies make billions of dollars? So OPEC and coffee. But what I say about coffee, again, we need an OPEC for cacao. We are speaking today here from Ethiopia. Ethiopia, I understand, but correct me if I'm wrong, is not a major cacao or cocoa, depending on your accent, producer. Yet I assure you that you go, and I say this about Ethiopia, but it's applicable to all of our countries. I assure you that if you want to buy chocolate here, you will buy a Swiss, an American, British brand. And not a brand from Ghana. And therefore, we need those OPECs of the South to do the same thing in terms of cocoa. And why did I say Ghana? Because that's point number one, regional integration. But we need it also in critical minerals. As I've mentioned in the past, there is no energy transition, there is no transition to a more sustainable world with solar energy, with electric cars, and so on and so forth, without the critical minerals in our soils, in our territories. Yet we export, well, not we, there is a single country that exports the majority of the cobalt needed for electric vehicles, EV batteries, and that is the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And they export the cobalt, and then must intend to buy the electric vehicles. Now, nobody is saying that it should not be exported. We want to support the energy transition, but we don't want it to be a green colonialism. And therefore, an OPEC of cobalt or critical minerals would enable countries to say, well, look, sure, you can assemble your car wherever you want, but at the very least, we will not export raw cobalt, but you can invest in a factory that creates jobs, creates sustainability in our countries to transform that cobalt into EV batteries before it's exported. Now, OPECs of the South. So we need to invest, in short, in the economic mechanisms that allow us as countries to achieve greater emancipation. But the third, and this is part of the things that I wanted to mention next week, hence why my critique in my introduction was limited to the current existing dualistic frameworks, and I didn't enter into the proposals, so I will not develop it too much. But what I will say is we must be able to articulate instruments of the South, of the Greater South, that emancipate themselves from excessive ideological politicization. We have to understand, in creating our instruments with executive capacities, an instrument like the OSCE, that whether you are left-wing or right-wing, whether you are a monarchy or a republic, high-value addition industrialization is in your interest. Greater integration for trade and people-to-people exchanges is in your interest. That the reform of the international financial architecture to reduce debt burdens and increase high-value added highly concessional finance access is in your interest. And I say this because, mind you, LDCs, in terms of loans and financing for renewable energies and batteries, have a cost of capital that is double that of advanced economies. Or that, for example, Kenya, a country that has not defaulted, as far as I recall, on any of its loans, has a credit rating that is worse than Greece, which has defaulted 5 times. Now, all of this is in our interest, and this transcends the fact of whether a government is left-wing or right-wing, whether a government is a monarchy or a republic. But none of our countries can do it alone. And therefore, we must articulate effective intergovernmental platforms and instruments like the OSCE that is capable to find consensus on the areas that unite us and that are of fundamental interest to our peoples, to act together towards the transformation of that financial architecture and other sectors. Now, taken together, those measures that I've summarized, that is, enhanced regional integration, economic leverage points, and platforms of genuine, effective South-South cooperation that is not excessively ideological or excessively politicized. Taken together, these measures, all necessary, none of them sufficient alone, will enable us then to go and demand, and not only beg for, the transformation, the reform of the existing institutions. And I say this because, mind you, when we are speaking of this, we're mostly speaking of Bretton Woods institutions and the United Nations, when we speak of reforming the international system. And again, I said this is without filters. I will be very clear. No body in multilateralism better exemplifies the imbalance and the inequity in our world than the United Nations Security Council. That at this height, at this particular stage of history, only 5 countries, of which only 1 belongs to the South, have the privilege to block, to veto the most urgent and important decisions facing humanity at will is mind-boggling, to say the least. But at the same time, whilst we recognize that imbalance, anybody that tells you that the United Nations should disappear is either foolish or dangerous. We need, of course, the United Nations, but we need it reformed so thoroughly, starting by that Security Council. But to reform it thoroughly, we need the leverage that I mentioned through these 3 measures. Regional integration that finds strength in unity. Economic leverage points that move us from dependency to sovereignty. And, of course, platforms of coordinated action that find the common ground, like the OSCE. We can demand that reform. Demand it. And when we demand that reform, as I said, if the Security Council must exist, because we need a smaller body than the United Nations General Assembly in order to act with more agility in the face of threats to peace and security, which I can accept as an argument, then let that body reflect the world as it is and not as it was. And therefore, let us open up, and that is what I propose, that this United Nations Security Council be composed of our regional and continental organizations. That the African Union should have a seat, that the Arab League should have a seat, that CELAC should have a seat, that ASEAN should have a seat, that the European Union should have a seat. Each of them composed of countries, and the seat being held by whoever is holding the presidency of that body. And if, for certain historical compromises and lack of intergovernmental organizations, we need to keep some of the historic holders of the P5, then yes, we can do that, but on objective and transparent criteria. In that case, let the United States of America keep their seat, let China keep its seat, but then we must also open the door to other countries, such as India, to open the door. And I fundamentally believe that these are the measures in a very summarized manner that can enable the South to shape that new system, to build a new system. That being said, that is not enough. Because in addition to that, we must build, but I will not develop this more because I have done so extensively in past sessions, and I have done it as well in a letter from the Greater South, which I invite you to read. It is free of charge, online on southletter.com. But we must also foster people-led cooperation. People-to-people exchanges, platform for our civil societies, our artists, our intellectuals to meet, propose, articulate, be involved, be protagonists of that new order. And India, to a certain degree, it is not perfect, it needs to be fine-tuned. We have embodied that principle by having, in addition to our member states, associate members who are from civil society and academia. This is what I would say in terms of your question, James. For now, I will always be happy to develop more, but what I would be delighted if you read a letter from the Greater South and then shared your views on the measures proposed. Of course, if I haven't answered satisfactorily, perhaps may I suggest, humbly, that you just turn off auto-locking. Thank you. I'm just waiting for the other questions. Thank you. Now, in this regard, if I have not answered satisfactorily, you can always, of course, ask a follow-up question. If I have time today, I will answer it. Now, I see a question from Instagram, from Cesar Josue Padilla, I imagine from Latin America. How does Global South cooperation address the importance of popular economies, which are the means of life of the majority of our populations, without pretending to sacrifice them as the expendables in development? That is a crucial question. One that I do not know if I can do justice to in a short live stream answer. And perhaps that is actually a theme, and I'm looking at the team here for them to remind me, to perhaps write about, or even have a conference about. Maybe we can organize a conference about this. But what I can say so far is that there is, again, no universal recipe, right? There is no universal recipe insofar as, precisely because we are speaking of popular economies, of economies of our communities, we have to take first and foremost their contexts, their priorities, their realities and their aspirations into account. And therefore, in this regard, it's not possible to merely say we ought to do this and we ought to do that without first consulting them. Because in that case, we would be replicating the dynamics of the world as we know it, which treats our communities as expendable, with good intentions sometimes, by not asking for their opinion. But in this regard, how can South-South cooperation, because that is your question, can South-South cooperation contribute to popular economies without disregarding our communities? And this, I would argue, is in the mechanisms that we instill and the platforms that we create at the level of the South. Because remember, the South, when speaking of the Greater South, and this is why I say there is no universal recipe, 80% of humanity, more than 80% of humanity lives in the South. There is no simple recipe for all communities, for billions of people, because otherwise we would be denying ourselves by denying the diversity. That being said, at the level of the Greater South, which is at the macro scale, We need to create, as I mentioned earlier, the platforms for our civil society organizations, our community leaders to meet, exchange, learn from each other. We need to create, and the OSCE is working towards this. In fact, I say this because I have forgotten about this. This is very important from my visit to Argentina. We have to follow up with one municipality that wanted to work towards the same idea that I am proposing. So please remind me, Betty. But creating, for instance, a conference of cities and towns of the Greater South, of municipalities. Because today, international cooperation amongst municipalities is always directed from north to south. To have horizontal cooperation amongst our municipalities. But of course, and this perhaps is less from the perspective of South-South cooperation, but in the approach we adopt more generally, whether it's local or national, we have to start adopting more democratic forms of involvement. Now, mind you, I know I said democratic, and some of our countries or our officials say democratic and they jump. No need to mention who. But no, mind you, when I say democratic, I mean it in a profound sense. Because yes, it would be pointless, honestly, to list out all the regimes and governments that peoples of the South throughout history had to suffer. That list might be illuminating, but not to our purposes. But that list, in any case, would not diminish the, how shall I say it politely, the responsibility of the imported Western liberal democracy models that instead of making our citizens protagonists, have generated more and more public disconnection and alienation from public affairs. I mean, have we not seen collectively, in the North, not in the South, the growing, exponentially growing, levels of abstention at elections? Have we not seen the constant promotion of the useful vote, le vote utile, they say in French? The useful vote, that is, don't vote for the candidate in whom you believe. Vote in the one that is most likely to win and is not too far away from your convictions. Have we not seen that? Does that not tell us that people are being alienated from public affairs? Because, and in our countries, this is already bad in the North, but in our countries, it is even worse. Because what good is the right to vote if it only provides you the privilege of benefiting from an administered misery? Now, the question of democratic participation is not, democracy is not about appearances, about how often you convene people to vote, and you convene them every few years as a delegated contract, not a shared responsibility to be exercised. No, democracy is consciousness building. And it is participation. And I say this, Cesar, I say this in full awareness that it might be controversial. But the truth is that there is no democratic process without consciousness building. And consciousness building means politicization in the noble sense of the term. And to quote Frantz Fanon, or paraphrase him, to politicize is not to make a speech to the people. It is to talk with the people, to make them understand that if we move forward, it is thanks to their strength. And if we move backwards, it is because of their absence. And that, of course, is not through, as I said before, presidentialist republics imported from the north in terms of their models, where we celebrate every few years elections without spirit, and where people do not even go to vote anymore, and if they do, it is with no conviction, and then for a few years, they are asked to remain away from policy making. No. As I said before, true democracy is involving our peoples constantly in the building of the nation, allowing them to be protagonists of their own destiny. And that is why I said I'm going to say something controversial. I would go so far as to say that a monarchy or a one-party state that has achieved constant, continuous, popular participation in public affairs will be more democratic in spirit and in practice than a presidential republic where people are convened to vote every 5 years or 4 years and then are to stay at home and suffer the consequences of their so-called vote. But what this means concretely for our countries is that each one of our countries, each one of our peoples needs to develop their own democratic forms. There is no universal recipe. And these democratic forms can be adapting ancestral traditions and modernizing them, or developing entirely new ones based upon current contexts, sensibilities, and realities. But of course, when I say this, I want to be very clear also. By rejecting a certain dogma, we cannot fall into the other extreme. Popular participation, yes. But if history has anything to teach us, is when popular participation is not also accompanied by effective leadership and direction, it does not lead to transformation. It leads, at best, to stagnation, or worse, to anarchy, or to assemblies, constant committee meetings and assemblies that are never able to take a decision, neither to protect what we have nor to build the new. And therefore, we must find the mature equilibrium between constant popular participation and leadership that is, or that I would call vertical, is the word is coming in Spanish. No, not horizontal. In Spanish, but balanced.
What is the word in Spanish?
Verticalmente equilibrada.
Vertically balanced?
Yes, but it sounds... Well, it doesn't matter. That has a verticality that is balanced by a historical consciousness and an understanding of commitment to the process. It is in that equilibrium that we can create transformation. That is, we neither want authoritarianism, nor do we want endless assemblies that are incapable of taking a decision because that believe that only saying something transforms the world. We need popular participation on the one hand, not democratic vitrines, and we need, on the other, balanced leadership, not messianic intentions. So, I know what I'm saying sounds very general, but we are again speaking of 3 continents and 80% of humanity. That being said, as I said, this is at the level of each country, each community, but also at the level of our greater self, by, as I said earlier, involving our communities to the extent possible, and manageable, of course, in our deliberations and decision making. We must also pass in conventions and national laws that take into account the views and the participation, and even perhaps, since we were speaking of the Security Council, we could speak of a veto power of our communities in certain instances when a certain project might impact irremediably their livelihoods. I don't know if I've answered you clearly enough. If I haven't, feel free to ask Cesar a follow-up question. But the team feels I was clear enough.
Yes.
Because otherwise I can develop. They are telling me, Cesar, that not that I was clear, basically. That's what they're saying because I'm the SG. But what they're saying is you're speaking too much. So I will move on. I see a question from... that is nice. Thank you very much, Helen. I see a question from Helen that says, Excellency, first allow me to extend my congratulations on the adoption of your cat, Harakat. It is not Harakat with K-H-A-T, because then that would mean qat. I did not mean the chewing kind. Not the... It's H-R... Yes, because, qat is a certain substance, a plant, that is chewed in some areas of the Arab world and in here. And it was written like this. It is not haraqat. It is harakat. So anyway, ask again your Arab friends if you don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, it is truly an honor to see you and to hear your insightful discussions about the OSCE and the Greater South every Sunday. I would like to kindly ask you two questions. How does horizontal solidarity reflect the principles of equality, mutual respect and shared benefit among Greater South nations? Okay, I will be very quick about this because it's a very important question, but I am not a philosopher and I cannot enter into the analysis of semantics. But what I can tell you, horizontal solidarity is basically recognizing that what we want is not receiving the leftovers of a meal, but sharing the meal as equal because we share a common destiny. And to exemplify this, because otherwise I will be branded as this individual that constantly loses himself in the abstract. Concretely, I mentioned it in the last episode, I will repeat it here. One of the greatest examples of what ought to have been solidarity was during the pandemic. During the pandemic, it was in humanity's interest to ensure that every country achieved collective herd immunity. Because as soon as every country achieved collective herd immunity, we would get out faster from COVID. Yet, on the one hand, of course, I've already mentioned how some countries had monopolized production, but on the other, which is the most important one, WHO, Gavi, and another entity had created COVAX as an instrument, a multilateral instrument, to distribute charitably vaccines to least developed countries or countries that or low-income countries and middle-income countries. Middle-income countries. Now, COVAX, that is, wealthy countries, northern countries would pour in money into COVAX, and COVAX would buy vaccines and distribute them to the countries who could not afford them. Now, in COVAX, in COVAX's own words, in September 2021, because I remember reading this, and I wrote an op-ed about it that everybody refused to publish, which is that in their own words, in a statement they made in September 2021, they had received the money, but they were unable to meet their target of distributing X number of vaccines. Why? Again, because some had monopolized production. And therefore, whilst you had the funds, there were no longer any vaccines to purchase. Now, what would solidarity mean in terms of what you are saying, which is equality, mutual respect, and shared benefit, have looked like had COVAX not been a charitable instrument, but a solidarity-based instrument? What it would have not been a space where rich countries pour in funds and the funds are and COVAX purchases vaccines and redistributes them. But instead, it would have been a centralized distribution system of vaccines in a time of a global pandemic that affected all of us, where COVAX would have allocated the number of vaccines per country based upon population proportionally. And that is solidarity. And that is mutual respect. And that is shared benefit. Because it means we are not just giving you leftovers, we are sharing the meal, but we understand that by sharing the meal, I will also be better off. And in COVID, that was exemplified, because had we done this, we would have been out of the pandemic, I firmly believe, much sooner. The second question you have is, how can countries of the global south collaborate through horizontal solidarity to reduce dependency on the global north? Thank you very much. Well, I don't want to develop too much, because I think I've already done it several times, and I've done it earlier today, perhaps it was before you asked your question, which is what I said: we need to create more instruments of our countries, more financial instruments of our countries, like the Greater South Development Bank, like the OSCE, creating more OPECs in sectorial areas of the South. And we must build a southern identity, a southern consciousness, something I discussed in a previous episode. I will not elaborate anymore. And all of this taken together will enable us, by investing in strategic sectors that I mentioned earlier. We need to invest in education, but with our own means, that reflects our realities, a transformed education, a balanced and inclusive education, one health systems, integral health systems, where you are preventing as much as you are curing, in sustainable agriculture, in renewable energies, in endogenous technologies that we develop from our own capacities, in high value added industrialization. Let us produce our own instant coffees, and let us produce our own batteries. And finally, we need to invest in the infrastructure that connects our countries. And I believe, and when I say the infrastructure, I give one example last episode, which I will repeat here, which is submarine internet fiber cable, fiber optic cables to connect Africa and Latin America in terms of data, because we cannot speak of data sovereignty when all the cables and therefore all the data transit through the north. These are some of the measures that must be taken. Of course, for a more precise and question about one of the specific sectors, I'll be very happy to answer. I see a question from Facebook by Kiruel KB. Kiruel? Ethiopian, no? Kiruel. Africa faces the dual challenge of achieving energy access for industrialization while navigating the climate crisis. Current global climate finance mechanisms are often inaccessible and debt-fueled. What innovative grant-based financing models can the OSCE champion to unlock investment in Africa's vast renewable energy potential, turning it into the engine for our sustainable and sovereign industrial development? Crucial question. I think that in one dimension of it has already been covered in a certain sense, by building the leverage points as countries that allow us as well to demand from our northern partners that they pay their fair share. Currently, as you know, the Greater South has the least contributed to climate change. All of our countries of the Greater South. Even China, because some people say, oh, but China keeps polluting, and in Europe and in North America, they use the fact that China is polluting a lot as an excuse for their own pollution. Yet the truth is that, yes, China in absolute nominal terms pollutes more than Germany. But China is 1 billion people. So when you divide up China's pollution, CO2 emissions per capita, They pollute less than Germany. But in any case, our countries contributed the least to climate change, yet we bear the brunt of that climate crisis. We are the region of the world that has the most minerals to create solar panels, to create no, not just to create the minerals to create solar panels, but also, or to create electric vehicle batteries. But also, I'm sorry to say, if I'm going to use solar power, I feel much more confident using it in Saudi Arabia than I am using it in London. Because I lived in London, I did not see the sun that often. That is just a bit of humor. But the main point is that our northern partners have made certain commitments of financing, grant-based, that they have not delivered on. Because even their commitments that they made at COP was insufficient, to say the least. But again, we are in a position, like with regards to international organizations, of begging, of supplicating. We must now build the leverage to start demanding. And how do we build that leverage? As I mentioned earlier, strengthening regional integrations, creating our own economic leverage points. And 3, South-South, Southern platforms like the OSCE to coordinate. But of course, that's only part of the question. Part of the leverage and the economic leverage points is one of the initiatives of the Organization of Southern Cooperation, which is the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, the club, which was created by our member states historically in November 2023. As the world's first and only club of debtors. In the face of the Paris Club of Creditors, there is now the Addis Club of Borrowers or Debtors. Even though I understand that the United Nations now, since June or July, are proposing in the Compromiso de Sevilla, in paragraph 48I, the creation of a borrowers forum with a UN secretariat for it. But anyway, there is already one, which is the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers. That is where our countries can come together to negotiate collectively debt relief, but also by working together to get highly concessional finance. Because by getting collective loans, we also reduce risks for creditors, which also reduces interest rates, which extends maturities. But you're asking, of course, about grant-based financing models. But let me, of course, now there's much that can be done in terms of grant-based, but let me take this one step further. And one step further is to say to ourselves very clearly, because as I said, we are the champions in the South. We are the champions, my dear Kirwel, at going into a corner and crying at our own misery. You look at all financial flows in a given year between North and South. There is $1 trillion that goes from the North to the South. There is $2 trillion that go from the South to the North. So clearly, we have the means. What we need is to organize ourselves and to put in the measures. One of the examples I have given last time, I will repeat it now, is all the big tech companies, the digital ones, Twitter, Facebook, Meta, Alphabet, Microsoft, their business models have shifted from selling consumer goods to data. Data that they collect from their users. We constitute the majority of the world. We are, as opposed to the North, young societies. Therefore, they also know that we are the future of their economies, of their business models. And yet, when is the last time that Meta or Alphabet, or the others, Microsoft, have paid, because I know we celebrate Bill Gates constantly as if he was a head of state. And I'm happy that we do. He did some good. But when's the last time that Microsoft paid taxes in one of our countries, despite clearly making money out of our countries? Now, what does that mean concretely in terms of the South and how we can achieve? It's not perhaps a grant, but it's justice, which allows us to finance our models, because we were speaking of industrialization, technology comes into that. None of our countries, of course, can negotiate with those tech giants, because, to be very honest, you look at the market capitalization of Apple. I think last time I checked was 2 years ago. It was 500 billion. Now I think they're at $1 trillion of market capitalization, if not more. That is more than the nominal GDP value of Switzerland or of Finland. But our countries collectively can do that. But negotiate for what? And what is the leverage point again? It's not just access to our markets, that is our countries, but it is also understanding that our taxing systems are outdated. They are designed to tax entities that have a registered office. But in the era of the digital economy, this is no longer applicable. So how do you tax as a single country those companies? Very difficult to do. But if we unite as the Greater South, we can ensure a taxing regime, a universal taxing regime across the South for those companies. And if it's not a taxing regime, then it can be a certain percentage, a certain amount agreed per annum that can be redirected to a common innovation, Southern Innovation Fund that would go and invest from those funds, from those billions of dollars in our startup ecosystems, in our technological companies, in our industrialization efforts. This is what I would say in a very, very brief sense. Of course, some of your questions I have addressed in previous interventions of mine regarding industrialization, investing in coffee, creating the infrastructure that opens up commerce between our peoples. But this is what I would say. Of course, if you are unhappy with the depth or the substance of the answer, do feel free to challenge, and I will be delighted to develop further. I think that I see here that they are writing from the team, saying that I should wrap up. So, in this regard, what I will do is I will indeed wrap up. And I am, if there's any further questions, I will address them in the next episode. But what I will say, for now, is I will quote myself, which is very rude, usually, but I need to promote the book, which I wrote here, that today the wind blows in our favor. The only thing that is left for us collectively from the Greater South is to determine the destination. And therefore, let us make sure, together, with a bold, visionary plan and unwavering determination, that it is not only a question of a change in winds, but that we make sure that this becomes a deliberate change of course. Thank you, and see you at the next episode.